This book is divided into 4 parts. Each one of the boxes represents one part of the book. So let's start with the first one, which is fundamental techniques in handling people. The first technique that the author talks about is that we should never criticize, condemn, or complain. Well, how did he come to this conclusion? Well, because if we criticize someone for doing something wrong, it will automatically put them into a position where they are trying to defend themselves and their actions. Because nobody would consciously do a thing that they knew was wrong, right? There has to be a reason behind it. And so now they will try to justify themselves and maybe even condemn you in return. It is also dangerous, because it hurts a person's precious pride and arouses resentment towards you. And it's also not effective, because in most cases, it doesn't even correct the situation that has been condemned in the first place. So let me give you an example that the author gave in the book. George B. Johnston of Enid, Oklahoma, is the safety coordinator for an engineering company. And one of his responsibilities is to see that the employees wear their hard hats whenever they are on the job in the field. He reported that whenever he came across workers who were not wearing their hard hats, he would tell them with a lot of authority of the regulation and that they must comply. As a result, he would get a sullen acceptance, and often after he left, the workers would have removed their hats. So he decided to try a different approach. The next time he found some of the workers not wearing their hard hat, he asked if the hats were uncomfortable or did not fit properly. Then he reminded the men in a pleasant tone of voice that the hat was designed to protect them from an injury and suggested that it always be worn on the job. The result was increased compliance with the regulation with no resentment or emotional upset. And so if we should never criticize, what should we do instead? And that brings us to the next principle: give honest and sincere appreciation. But whatever you do, don't be flattering. You might ask, what's the difference? That's simple. I will use the author's own words. One is sincere, the other is sincere. One is selfish, the other unselfish. One comes from the heart out, the other comes from the teeth out. One is universally admired, the other are universally condemned. So, the next time your parents make you a delicious meal, tell them that it is delicious, show them that you appreciate it. And the third and the last principle mentioned in this first part of the book is to arouse in the other person an eager want. So what he means by this is that if you are in a situation where you want someone to do something or not to do something, you have to stop and think to yourself for a moment, how can I make this person want to do it? Because action springs out of what we want. We eat because we want to eat. We work out because we want the benefits of working out. We go to work because we want the money, and so on. Carnegie gives an awesome example of this in the book. He said that during the summer he went fishing quite often, and he personally likes strawberries and cream. But for some weird reason, fish prefer worms. So he didn't go fishing with a strawberry spiked on his hook, he put on some worms instead. Because that is what the fish want. Of course, we are interested in what we want, but no one else is. Everybody is just like you, interested in what they want. So the next time you want to persuade someone to do something, try to see things from their angle as well as from your own. Try to somehow tie up what you want with what the other person wants. Okay, so now we went through the first part of the book, which were basically the fundamentals that everyone should use in their day-to-day life. Only if they want to be better at handling people, of course. And now we get into the second part, which covers the 6 ways to make people like you. And it starts with the first one of the key principles in this book: to become genuinely interested in other people. You have to realize that other people are not interested in you, not until you become interested in them. And even then, they are still far more interested in themselves. Let me prove it to you. Think about the last time you were shown a group photo that you were in as well. Who did you look at first? Yeah, yourself. We are all like that. So if we become genuinely interested in others, if we do things that require time and energy and thoughtfulness for them, we will make friends inevitably. The next principle is really beautiful, simple and easy to implement. All you got to do is smile. Smile when you go to the grocery store today. Smile at the cashier. Smile at your co-workers. Smile at the stranger that you come across at the street. Smile at the universe. And if you don't feel like smiling, force yourself to smile and people will smile back at you, which will cause you to smile naturally. And be aware that happiness depends not on outer conditions, but it depends on your inner conditions. So if you have trouble smiling, a little self-affirmation, which basically means that You are going to say to yourself, for example, I am a kind person, or I am a cheerful human being, or something like that over and over again. You will keep repeating it in your head until it will eventually become a reality. And remember that a smile is useless until it's given away. Okay, so now that I got you smiling onto the screen, let's get to the third principle, which is all about remembering people's names. A person's name is to that person the sweetest and the most important sound in any language. And even then, most of us, when introduced to a stranger, can't remember their name by the time we say goodbye. And that is simply because we don't make the effort to concentrate, repeat, and fix it in our minds. So the next time you see someone you know, don't shy away from calling on them by their name in a nice, friendly tone, with a smile on your face, and you will experience the results by yourself. And so, as we get into the fourth chapter, I want to tell you a story that is told in this book of how a poor Dutch immigrant boy made himself one of the most successful magazine editors in America, because I think it's really astonishing and really illustrates how this principle is so powerful. So, how did he do it? That is a long story, but the way he started can be told briefly. He left school when he was 13, but he didn't give up the idea of education whatsoever. He saved up some money and bought an encyclopedia of American biography where he read about the lives of famous people at the time and wrote them letters asking them for additional information about themselves. For example, he wrote to General Grant asking about a certain battle, and Grant read it, drew a map for him, and invited him to dinner and spent the evening talking to him. And experiences like this gave him confidence and filled him with ambition and a vision that shaped his life. And all of this was thanks to the use of one simple thing. He listened. He listened attentively to what the famous people had to say. So, what does the author want to say in this chapter? If you aspire to be a good conversationalist, be an attentive listener. To be interesting, be interested. Ask questions that the other person will enjoy answering. Encourage them to talk about themselves and their accomplishments, and never interrupt. That is the worst thing you can possibly do. And now on to the fifth principle, which is to talk in the terms of the other person's interest. As you may know from the previous chapters, people are interested in themselves more than in anyone else. So if before or during a conversation with someone, you make the effort to do some research and find out what they're interested and passionate about, and talk and ask questions about that, it will make them warmer towards you and more prone to persuasion. Let me give you another perfect example from the book. When the genius William Lyon Phelps, essayist and professor of literature, was 8 years old, he was spending a weekend visiting his aunt. A middle-aged man called one evening, and after a polite skirmish with his aunt, he devoted his attention to little William. At the time, William really liked boats, and so the visitor, after he found that out, talked with him only about that. After he left, William spoke of him with a lot of enthusiasm. His aunt told him that he was a New York lawyer and he didn't really care about boats. And William asked, "But why then did he talk all the time about boats?" "Because he is a gentleman," told him his aunt. "He saw that you were interested in boats, and he talked about the things he knew would interest and please you. He made himself agreeable." These were the wise words from William's aunt, which he never forgot. And the last principle in how to make people like you is to make the other person feel important, and do it sincerely. I feel that this principle is kind of a mix of all the previous 5. To make the other person feel important, you have to be kind and sincere, you have to show interest in them, ask questions that they are going to be pleased to answer, and listen to them attentively. If you keep this attitude in mind while meeting new people or people that you already know, it will only benefit the relationship. So, now we are getting into the third part of the book, which the author called How to Win People into Your Way of Thinking. Chapter 1. The only way to get the best out of an argument is to avoid it. Arguments are stupid and futile. You can't win an argument. You can't, because if you lose it, you lose it. And if you win it, you lose it. Why? Because the person you are arguing with is convinced more than ever that he or she is absolutely right. Because you made them fight for their opinion. They put effort in defending it, and then there is no wonder that they are going to think that they are right. A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. But then arises a question: what to do when you come to a disagreement with someone? Well, here are some suggestions from her article Bits and Pieces to avoid creating an argument out of a disagreement. So the first suggestion is to welcome the disagreement. Remember the slogan: when two partners always agree, one of them is not necessary. If there is some point you haven't thought about, be thankful if it is brought to your attention. Perhaps disagreement is your opportunity to be corrected before you make a serious mistake. Distrust your first instinctive impression. Our first natural reaction in a disagreeable situation is to be defensive. But be careful. Keep calm and watch out for your first reaction. It may be you at worst, not your best. Listen first. Give your opponents a chance to talk. Let them finish. Do not resist, defend, or debate. This only raises barriers. Try to build bridges of understanding. Don't build higher barriers of misunderstanding. Look for areas of agreement. When you have heard your opponents out, dwell first on the points and areas on which you agree. Be honest. Look for areas where you can admit error and say so. Apologize for your mistakes. It will help disarm your opponent and reduce defensiveness. Promise to think over your opponent's ideas and study them carefully. And mean it. Your opponents may be right. It is a lot easier at this stage to agree to think about their points than to move rapidly ahead and find yourself in a position where your opponents can say, "Well, we tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen." Thank your opponents sincerely for their interest. Anyone who takes time to disagree with you is interested in the same things that you are. Think of them as people who really want to help you, and you may turn your opponents into friends. Ask yourself some hard questions. For example, could my opponent be right? Will my reaction drive my opponents further away or draw them closer to me? Will my reaction elevate the estimation good people have of me? Will I win or lose? What price will I have to pay if I win? If I'm quiet about it, will the disagreement blow over? Is this difficult situation an opportunity for me? Okay, so now we know that arguments are no good and we know how to avoid one. The next thing that Carnegie preaches is to never tell a man he's wrong. Show respect for other people's opinions. As Galileo Galilei said, you cannot teach a man anything. You can only help him to find it within himself. And he is absolutely right. If we want to make a lot of enemies, a very effective way is to tell others straight out of the gate that they are wrong. And if, on the other hand, you don't want to make enemies, then you should always assume that you are wrong, because you probably are. Even Theodore Roosevelt stated that if he could be right 75% of the time, he would reach the highest measure of his expectations. And if Roosevelt strived to be right 75% of the time, then imagine how unlikely is that you will be right the next time you're gonna think so. So start to adapt the attitude of assuming that you are wrong, and if there is a situation in which you are sure that the other person is incorrect, try to say something like this. Well, now, look. I thought otherwise, but I may be wrong. I frequently am. And if I'm wrong, I want to be put right. So, let's examine the facts. That is probably the best thing that you can say. Nobody will hardly ever object to phrases such as, I may be wrong, I frequently am. Let's examine the facts. So try that the next time you disagree with someone. And now we are getting into the next chapter, which is all about admitting your wrongdoings. Let me give you an example from the author. So, when he was at the park, walking his dog, he would often take him around without a muzzle or a leash. And one day he encountered a policeman that told him with a lot of authority that if he sees the dog without a leash or a muzzle again, he would get a fine. But the dog didn't really like the muzzle and the leash, and neither did Carnegie, so he decided to take the risk. But a week later, he came across the same policeman and without a leash or muzzle again. But Carnegie, instead of trying to defend himself and making excuses, started to condemn and criticize himself that he is aware of his mistake and that he is ready to take full responsibility for his actions. And he was really enthusiastic about it as well. And that policeman, being human, wanted the feeling of importance. So when Carnegie started to condemn himself, the only way he could nourish his self-esteem was to show mercy. But what do you think would happen if Carnegie started to defend himself and make excuses? Well, arguing with a policeman is not the best idea, is it? And if I could sum up the previous 3 chapters in just one sentence, I will use this one, which is directly from the book. When we are right, let's try to win people gently and tactfully, and when we are wrong, and that will be surprisingly often if we are honest with ourselves, let's admit our mistakes quickly and with enthusiasm. Alright, let's get on with the next one, in which the author tries to explain to us that if we want something from someone, or we want to change someone's mind about something, it is always a good choice to try to get your point across in the most friendly approach possible. As Abraham Lincoln said, a drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall. To illustrate, there was a story mentioned in the book from one of the attendants of Carnegie's course in which a guide tried to get his rent reduced. And so as he went to speak with the landlord, he decided to take a friendly approach. At first, he appreciated the apartment. He gave an honest and sincere appreciation. And then he said that he would love to stay, but that he couldn't afford it. So the landlord offered him that he could decrease the rent a little. But the guy wanted more, so he said a figure that he wanted and said that that is the amount that he could afford, and the landlord agreed, without saying a word. He was happy to do it because the guy was the first tenant that was appreciative and satisfied, unlike the other tenants. So, now that we know that we should be friendly from the start, the next thing we should strive for, if we want to win a person to our way of thinking, is to ask these little gentle questions that the other person is going to agree with. We want to get them to say yes as soon as possible. Because people tend to stick to things that they did previously. So by getting them to say yes at the start, you are far more likely to get a yes at the end. Let me tell you how this method helped to a bank teller to trying to secure a prospect which was unwilling to share some of information about him to the bank. The bank teller, instead of telling him about the bank's regulations, agreed with him. He told him that the information he refused to give them was not absolutely necessary, even though it was. However, he said, suppose you have money in the bank at your death. Wouldn't you like to have the bank transfer it to your next of kin, who is entitled to it according to law? Yes, of course, he replied. Don't you think, he continued, that it would be a good idea to give us the name of your next of kin, so that, in the event of your death, we could carry out your wishes without an error or delay? Again, he said, yes. The young man's attitude softened and changed when he realized that we weren't asking for this information for our sake, but for his sake. Most people trying to win others into their way of thinking do too much talking themselves. Let the other person talk. Ask them questions, let them tell you a few things about themselves and their accomplishments. If you disagree with them, you might be tempted to interrupt, but don't. That is the biggest mistake you can make. They won't pay attention to you, but they still have a lot of ideas of their own, crying for expression. So stop and let the other person do a great deal of the talking. So, to illustrate the next principle that Carnegie preaches in his book, I will use a part of the book. It is a story about a guy named Eugene Wesson. Mr. Wesson sold sketches to studios that would then create a design and sell it to stylists and textile manufacturers. He was trying to sell his sketches to one of the leading stylists for 3 years without success. After 150 failures, he decided to take a different approach. With a half of dozen unfinished sketches under his arm, he rushed over to the buyer's office. I want you to do me a little favor, if you will, he said. Here are some uncompleted sketches. Won't you please tell me how we could finish them up in such a way that you could use them? The buyer looked at the sketches for a while without uttering a word. Finally he said, leave these with me for a few days, Wesson, and then come back and see me. Wesson returned 3 days later, got his suggestions, took the sketches back to the studio and had them finished according to the buyer's ideas. The results? All accepted. After that, this buyer ordered scores of sketches from Wesson, all drawn according to the buyer's ideas. I realized why I had failed for years to sell him, said Mr. Wesson. I had urged him to buy what I thought he ought to have. Then I changed my approach completely. I urged him to give me his ideas. This made him feel that he was creating the designs, and he was. I didn't have to sell him, he bought. So let's all try this next time we encounter a problem like this. Let the other person feel that the idea is his or hers. The next principle is a principle that we should hold on to every day from now on. And that is to have an increased tendency to think always in terms of the other person's point of view and see things from that person's angle as well as from your own. Remember that other people may be totally wrong, but they don't think so. Don't condemn them. Any fool can do that. Try to understand them. There is a reason why the other person thinks and acts as he does. So try to find out that reason, and you have found the key to his actions and perhaps the key to his personality. If, as a result of watching this video, you get only this, an increased tendency to always think in terms of the other person's point of view and see things from that person's angle as well as from your own, then it could really transform your life. The next chapter in this part of the book is all about being sympathetic. Sympathize with the other person's ideas, views, feelings, problems. Try to imagine the world from their perspective. Try to understand them, why they do what they do. As Henry Ford said, if there is any one secret to success, it lies in the ability to get the other person's point of view and see things from that person's angle as well as from your own. Another principle suggests that we appeal to the person's nobler motives. But what does that mean? Well, according to Mr. J. Pierpont Morgan's observations, a person usually has two reasons for doing a thing. One that sounds good and a real one. And we should try to appeal to the one that sounds good. So let me explain it a little bit better by giving you an example from the book. When the late Lord Northcliffe found a newspaper using a picture of him that he didn't want published, he wrote the editor a letter. But did he say, "Please don't publish that picture of me anymore, I don't like it"? No, he wrote, "Please do not publish that picture of me anymore, my mother doesn't like it." He appealed to the nobler motive. He appealed to the respect and love that all of us have for motherhood. If you have an idea you want to present to someone, and you would like to increase the chance that he or she will like it as much as possible, then try to dramatize it. Make it vivid and interesting. Merely stating the truth isn't enough. It has to be made interesting and vivid. To make the author's point more clear, I will tell you the story that is mentioned in the book. James B. Boyton had to present a lengthy market report. His firm has just finished an exhaustive study for a leading brand of cold cream. Data were needed immediately about the competition in this market. The prospective customer was one of the biggest and most formidable men in the advertising industry. And his first approach failed almost before he began. He started arguing. He won his point, but the interview was over and to no avail. The second time, he didn't bother with tabulations or figures and data. He went to see this man and he dramatized facts. As he entered his office, he was busy on the phone. While he finished his conversations, he opened the suitcase and dumped 32 jars of cold cream on top of his desk, all competitors of his cream. On each jar there was a tag itemizing the results of the trade investigation, and each tag told its story briefly, dramatically. What happened? Well, there was no longer an argument. He picked up the first one, then another one of the jars of the cold cream, and read the information on the tag. A friendly conversation developed. He asked additional questions. He was intensely interested. He had originally given me only 10 minutes to present my facts, but then 10 minutes passed, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, and at the end of an hour we were still talking. He was presenting the same facts, but this time he was using dramatization, showmanship, and what a difference it made. The way to get things done, said Charles Schwab, is to stimulate competition. And I do not mean it in a sordid, money-getting way, but in the desire to excel. Everyone is competitive to some degree, so by introducing competition, we can motivate ourselves or others. I really like the story that was mentioned in this chapter, so I will tell it to you briefly. Charles Schwab had a mill manager whose people weren't getting the results they should. So one day, right before the night shift came on, he asked one of the workers, "How many hits did your shift make today?" "6. He grabbed a piece of chalk and scribbled the big 6 on the floor. And as the night shift came and asked what the big 6 on the floor meant, they were told that that's how many hits the day shift made. The next day, the night shift had rubbed out the big 6 and replaced it with 7. And as the day shift arrived, they saw the 7 on the floor and decided that they will show the night shift a thing or two. And as they quit that night, they left behind a big 10. Things were getting hot. And shortly after, this mill was turning out more production than any other mill in the plant. And that was the last chapter in the third part of the book, which was about how to win people to your way of thinking. And so we get to the final part of this book, which will show us principles that we should use if we aspire to be a good leader. When you find fault in someone, always begin with praise and honest appreciation for the things that you like about him. People tend to take criticism better after they were complimented. They got their feeling of importance. But still, the criticism ought not to be sharp and unpleasant. It should be more of a suggestion. As Carnegie said, a barber lathers a man before he shaves him. Or, there is another technique that you can use if you find fault in someone. Because many people, while using the first principle, will make an enormous mistake. They will begin with the praise and then they will say but, and then unleash the criticism. When you use the word but, you emphasize everything that comes after it. So when using the word but, you may as well turn it the other way around. This is not mentioned in the book, but that is just my personal suggestion. But what is suggested in the book is to replace the but with and. So for example, you don't say to your kid that, hey, your grades are really awesome, but if you tried a little harder, I think you could have gotten an A from maths. But instead you say, hey, your grades are really awesome, and I think if you tried even more harder this year, you may as well get an A from maths. You can see by yourself that the second sentence sounds way more appreciative than the first one. In the first one, the praise seems just like an insincere lead-in into criticism. And so, what the author is trying to say by this chapter is that when fighting fault, try to call attention to it indirectly. There was an example in the book that illustrates this quite well. Charles Schwab was passing through one of his mills and he noticed a group of his employees smoking right under a big red sign that read "No smoking." And this is what he did. He came up to them, handed each one a cigar and said, "I would appreciate it, boys, if you smoke these ones outside." Couldn't keep from loving a man like that, could you? Okay, so this chapter might have been a little confusing, so I will simplify it. Don't use but, replace it with and. And when you find fault, call attention to it indirectly. Next principle that a good leader should follow is to talk about your own mistakes first before criticizing the other person. Admitting your own mistakes and blunders, even if you haven't corrected them, can help you convince someone to change his behavior. There was an example in the book with a 15-year-old guy that started experimenting with cigarettes. His dad didn't want him to smoke, but he and his wife themselves were smokers, so they weren't a particularly good example for their son. But instead of threatening him, his dad told him that he as well started smoking when he was around his age, and that he has become so hooked that it is nearly impossible for him to stop now. He also reminded him how irritating the cough was. His son thought about it for a while and decided that he wouldn't smoke until he graduated from high school. But as the years went by, he never started smoking and has no intention of doing so. And this attitude from his father saved his son from a cigarette addiction. Just by admitting his own mistakes, he was able to achieve what the threat and criticism never could. If you are the one in charge, it is always better to ask questions and give suggestions than to give direct orders. People are more likely to accept an order if they have been involved in creating it. This is how a general manager of a small manufacturing plant handled a situation where he was given an opportunity to accept a large order that he knew he couldn't make in time. Instead of pushing people to speed up their work, he called everybody together and explained the situation to them. Then he started asking questions. Is there anything that we can do to handle this order? Can anyone think of different ways to process it through the shop that will make it possible to take the order? Is there any way to adjust our hours that would help? The employees came up with many ideas and insisted that he take the order. They approached it with a "we can do it" attitude, and the order was accepted and delivered on time. As a leader or manager, never criticize your subordinates, especially not in front of the eyes of other people. It will greatly hurt their pride, their dignity, and their sense of importance. And there is nothing that demoralizes a person more than a criticism from his superiors. And so, what we should do instead of criticizing the bad things about a person is to praise the good things, even the slightest improvements. And be specific with your praise, rather than just making a general flattering remark. Everybody likes to be praised, but nobody wants insincerity and flattery. And also in this chapter, the author reminds us that the principles taught in this book work only when they come from the heart, which is a really important point that you should bear in mind. The next principle that you should keep in mind if you want to excel in changing attitude and behaviors of others is to give them a fine reputation to live up to. There was an example in the book with a 4th grader named Timmy who was a problematic student. He caused some serious discipline problems in the class, picked up fights, teased girls, and just really misbehaved. But on the other hand, he learned really rapidly and mastered the schoolwork easily. And the teacher decided to give him a reputation to live up to. She said to him that she can see that he was a natural and born leader and that she was going to depend on him to help her make this the best 4th grade class this year. With that reputation to live up to, even a 9-year-old couldn't let her down. And he didn't. In the next principle, the author tells us that to get the most out of a person, we shall encourage them as much as we can and make it seem that the fault is really easy to correct. Because sometimes people are not doing their best simply because they have self-limiting beliefs. Maybe someone said to them that they are not good enough, or someone close to their heart had criticized them. But by encouraging people, we can help them break out of the cage that they put themselves in. And this simple thing, encouraging people and making the fault seem easy to correct, has the power to literally change a person's life, so use it. And the very last principle that Carnegie mentions in this book is to always make the other person happy about doing the things that you suggest. Why? Well, because the person is far more likely to do a thing when he gets something out of it, when he gets some benefit. If he doesn't see the benefit in it, he probably won't do it unless you use some methods like threatening him, for example, which are not recommended because they have some undesirable consequences to them. Okay, and so how do we make the other person want to do the thing that we suggest? Well, by showing them the benefits they will get out of it. Or at least show them what impact will the thing that you suggest have, so that they know why they are doing it. It is naive to believe that you will always get a favorable reaction from the other person when you use these approaches, but the experience of most people shows that you are more likely to change attitudes this way than by not using these principles. And if you increase your successes by even a mere 10%, you have become 10% more effective as a leader than you were before. And that is your benefit. So, if I could summarize this book in just a handful of sentences, I would say that in this book, the author suggests that we never criticize, condemn, or complain to people, that we should rather praise and show our appreciation and always be honest and sincere about it. And if we are in a social situation, that we should try our best to see things from the other person's point of view, try to understand why they do what they do, and try to shape our further actions accordingly. And I want to thank you very much for watching all the way to the end. See you in the next one.